Polls are good for football, and they have certainly added a lot to the interest of the game, but they don't necessarily prove who is the #1 team.
It's strictly it's a guessing game, and the result I don't think is accurate.
Anything that gives a newspaper a highly usable story, often a top story every Tuesday, has to be good.
I definitely feel like that a playoff for the national championship would be the correct thing to do.
The polls right now, I think they need to be changed. I don't know in what way, but I think that something does need to be done.
I think they're terrible. Maybe other years I think they're great.
Today in college football, it is opinion, actually popularity, that decides the national champion. The voters are men now mostly too old to play the game. They roam the sideline or watch from here in the press box. We call this voting method a poll. Now, should there be another way, perhaps a better way, to select the #1 collegiate team in the country? Maybe the answer is down there on the playing field. Polls or Playoff is brought to you by DuPont, makers of Anti-Leak Xerox Antifreeze, guaranteed not to run out on you. Rally Wax, the half-hour car wax, and easy-to-use Lucite paints, the work skippers.
We're going to drive home a point about Anti-Leak Xerox Antifreeze. It stops most common radiator leaks just like that. We guarantee it will stop and prevent leaks in your car radiator for a full year, or just write DuPont and get your money back. Anti-Leak Xerox Antifreeze is guaranteed not to run out on you.
The problem of the polls, of picking a #1 team in college football, can't be settled on the golf course. But as many of the nation's top coaches gather at Bella Vista, Arkansas, the question of polls or a playoff concerns Darrell Royal of Texas and Frank Broyles of Arkansas.
I was wondering if you think that the public feels that we should really go into it and try to find an answer to it.
Yeah, I think the public feels we should have a playoff. I think the substitute right now are the polls, of course, and polls are nothing but opinions, and I know you're by the Razorbacks like I am by the Longhorns. If they're going to vote, I hope they vote us up high.
And it creates a lot of interest, don't you think?
Oh, I think it's great.
You take the great team that you had last year, and it was a great football team, and then Penn State, people, their backers supported theirs, and I think this is why the public may feel that if we had a playoff, we might could settle some of these questions anyway, so that at the end of the season we would have one team that had outlasted the others. It may not be the best, but it would have outlasted the others.
Early in 1969, Ohio State was undisputedly #1. But in the East, there was a man who also had visions of being #1.
Come on, get to the ball. Let's go. Now look, let's get moving. It's standing right there. As big as life. Let's go, Green. Let's go, come on.
And all because you guys all thought you had it made. Look, don't think about making that much. Think about making 4 yards. And then you'll have a short yardage offense.
Joe Paterno's Nittany Lions, like Ohio State, were unbeaten and ranked second behind the Buckeyes. But a strange thing happened to Penn State on October 4, 1969. They whipped Kansas State 17-14, but fell from second to fifth in the polls as Texas became number 2. The Longhorns, up to the day they jumped ahead of Penn State, had won 3 games, beating California, Texas Tech, and Navy. None of those 3 finished 1969 with a winning record. Penn State beat Navy, Colorado, and Kansas State, certainly a tougher schedule. The question then is, what was the justification for moving Texas ahead of Penn State in the polls? Both teams remained undefeated, and when Ohio State was upset, Texas assumed the vacated top spot. Penn State had to settle for number 2, and Joe Paterno said,
I don't like polls because I think polls are an opinion, and it's a guessing game. And I don't think it's fair to have your team rated by people who haven't even seen you play, and they get into sectional pride and what have you, and it depends on how many people vote from a different area. I don't think it's fair to evaluate the number 1 team that way, really. I think the only thing we can hope for is that someday we will have a playoff, and we will be able to establish a true number 1, a true championship football team on the field. I've said that if we didn't have a playoff in pro football, why Baltimore would have been the national champions, Minnesota would have been the national champions, the Mets never would have made it. So these things, I think, can only be decided as to whether you're number 1 or not by playing each other.
after all, that's what it's all about, the challenge and the desire to be number 1.
I've often said I can remember the Yankees won 4 straight pennants in a row, but I can't tell you for life who finished second or third or fourth or fifth. It doesn't make any difference whether you're second or sixth, really. Right. It's who wins first. They remember first, and I think all football coaches know that finishing second isn't worth a darn.
You know, most wall paints will cover any pattern while they're still wet, but later, after the paint dries, well, here's a simulation of what can happen. Patterns show through, but not with new Lucite. Whatever you cover with new Lucite wet will stay covered after it's dry. New Lucite wall paint from DuPont, our latest work skipper.
Someone has said that winning the national title seems as important a goal as world peace. Probably just as frustrating. In the first 41 years of the polls, a total of 104 teams have been named number 1 at the end of the season. This whole barrel of madness called college football ratings all started in 1926. Frank Dickinson, a student at the University of Illinois, started a poll just as a hobby, and naturally he called it the Dickinson system. And now there are 7 recognized systems in the United States that each year select their number 1 team. The most widely publicized polls are the Associated Press, made up of a group of national sports writers and broadcasters, and the United Press International, composed of 35 college coaches. In the 40s, with teams like Powerful Army beating everyone in sight, the polls were in agreement. Frank Lay's Fighting Irish were another dominating force. Notre Dame, like their All-America Leon Hart, simply picked themselves up and ran away from the crowd. The 50s belonged to Bud Wilkinson in Oklahoma. Little Tommy McDonald was the hero as the Sooners won a record 47 straight. However, in 1954, the 2 major polls disagreed for the first time, one picking Ohio State while the other crowned UCLA. Again, in 1957, The poll split between Ohio State and Auburn. Then in 1964, more controversy. Arkansas in white went undefeated, shutting out its last 5 opponents. The Razorbacks finished 10-0, but wound up second in both major polls. The reason? Joe Namath and Alabama. Bear Bryant's Tide were at the peak of popularity. Like Arkansas, Bama zipped through 1964 without a loss. At the end of the regular season, both the AP and UPI polls crowned the Crimson Tide the national champion. But the Tide bumped into a bowl giant, Texas. A bomb from Jim Hudson to George Sauer Jr. upset Alabama 21-17 in the Orange Bowl. Even Namath's last-second sneak couldn't pull it out. Over in the Cotton Bowl, Arkansas tripped Nebraska. The Razorbacks were the only contending team to finish with a perfect record. But the polls were complete. Alabama was number 1.
We're going to drive home a point about anti-leak Xerox antifreeze. It stops most common radiator leaks just like that. We guarantee it will stop and prevent leaks in your car radiator for a full year, or just write DuPont and get your money back. Anti-leak Xerox antifreeze is guaranteed not to run out on you.
In 1965, Nebraska was the preseason pick for number 1. Like the Cornhuskers, All-America Harry Wilson was also hard to stop. When the regular season was over, Nebraska finished 3rd in the voting with a perfect 10-0 record. Coach Bob Devaney wondered how his team dropped from 1st to 3rd in the polls without losing a game. The UPI vote said Michigan State was number 1. The Spartans also finished the regular season 10-0, but were upset by UCLA in the Rose Bowl. The Associated Press poll, for the first time, waited until after the bowl games to name a champion. When Alabama defeated Nebraska in the Orange Bowl, AP ranked the Tide number 1, in spite of a record that included a loss and a tie.
You have to find some body of thought that is looking at let's say, 90 to 100 teams, and I suppose you have to turn to the fellows in the press box, the sports writers. But of course, it's ridiculous for a man who only sees the Pacific 8 Conference to pass judgment on whether or not Penn State is a good team, or perhaps even whether or not Texas is a good team. Also, a person who spends most of his time in press boxes from Austin to Dallas can't have any idea what kind of football is going on down in the Southeastern Conference.
The polls per se, I don't hold much faith in them. The people who vote tend very strongly to vote, in many cases, provincially and area-wise. They don't see the teams. I don't see them all. I wouldn't vote. I've refused to vote in polls more than once.
And I think the one thing that the polls should emphasize is that this is not the true and actual national champion, but a mythical national champion. I think we fail to emphasize that sometimes.
College football polls are wonderful for the fans. I think they're interesting, and it's part of the color with a great game of college football. However, I do not believe that a championship can be determined by polls. I think the opponents actually have to play one another.
The general feeling seems to be that polls are interesting, but not accurate, and they sometimes can affect how you play the game.
I would hope that we could do something about eliminating the effect of running up a score, what this does to influence people who vote. I think this is incompatible with sportsmanship in college football. And no matter how strong a person you are, how strongly you believe in sportsmanship, there's a great temptation to run up the score to improve your situation in the polls, and I don't think that's right.
I think that should be considered by the writers as they see a big score of 40 or 50 points over another team to find out when they did pull the
Toughness of schedule too, Frank, and you know, somebody like Notre Dame, they play a tough schedule. Now, You can say this about Notre Dame, they'll play you.
You found out.
You tell them. And if anybody thinks they're tough and they think they don't, Notre Dame won't play you, you're wrong. They'll play anybody. They've always got a big schedule. Well, some people that don't play quite as tough schedule might be undefeated, and a team with a real tough schedule could lose a game or two, and that doesn't mean they shouldn't be in the top 10.
As you can see, there are a lot of different ideas about the merits of the polls. Prior to 1969, 1966 was certainly the most controversial year. The Spartans of Michigan State had been co-champions a year earlier, and they started the season number 1 and looked invincible. They remained on top until the 4th week of the season, when in a driving rainstorm, they narrowly defeated Ohio State 11-8. Notre Dame at the time was ranked 2nd and also fielded a powerhouse. The same week Michigan State won in the mud, the Irish drubbed weak North Carolina 32-0. For some strange reason, the polls elevated Notre Dame to number 1 and dropped the Spartans. Thus, the Irish were on top when they squared off against Michigan State in that famous 10-10 tie. Notre Dame retained its ranking and won the national championship. Irish coach Tel Ra Production justified the decision.
Well, nobody beat us in 1966.
The Spartans' Duffy Doherty disagreed.
Well, nobody beat us either.
But Bear Bryant's Alabama team also was undefeated and without the blemish of a tie. Should Bama have been number 1? They were voted number 3.
The question there, of course, was the schedule. No doubt in the world about that. Alabama had played teams like Louisiana Tech and I believe Southern Mississippi, but I think that was the determining factor in the voters. They chose Notre Dame number 1 by sort of a narrow margin, as I recall it, over Michigan State, but there was no question about that Alabama was 3rd.
The two major polls picked Notre Dame. Michigan State screamed, and Bear Bryant said, it all evens out.
In 1966, I think we had the best football team in America, the best one I'd ever seen. And we were 3rd or something like that. And then one year, we backed in the bowl games by everyone being beaten but us. So I think it averages out.
Football is the only major college sport that crowns a champion by a sampling of opinion. A group of learned men, be they coaches or writers, get together and try to agree and then announce the number 1 team in the country. The team and the school that will receive that publicity that is worth thousands of dollars, that brings in new recruits, that builds more number 1 teams. Is there a better way to crown a national champion? Some say that a playoff is the answer. Michigan State's Duffy Doherty presented this plan 3 years ago.
I think that a national championship playoff could be designed that certainly would be in keeping with the academic picture of colleges and universities. My idea would be to take the 6 major conference champions. I'm referring to the Big 8, the Big 10, the Southeast, the Southwest, the Atlantic Coast, and the Pacific Coast. Take 2 teams at large from the independents and the other conference teams, teams such as might be Notre Dame 1 year, or Syracuse, or Penn State, or Army, 2 of these independents. Take the top 8 teams in the country for major collegiate football. Start the playoff the last week in November, and this would involve 4 games being played on college campuses. This would be the quarterfinals. 1 week later, which would be the first week in December, you'd have the semifinals, and then you'd have the finals along about the 10th of December.
We asked Southern California coach John McKay his opinion of a playoff system.
Talked about a playoff and such, but I don't think that would really solve a lot of things. I could see complications there. We could beat a team in another district in early season play, let's say 50 points. End up not winning our conference championship by losing by a point to a team out here. The team we beat by 50 points is now in the national playoff because they won their conference championship. They turn around and beat this team from out here. They're now the national champions. We could have basically a record of 10-1 and have beaten the national champions by 50 points. Darrell, do you think there's any possibility we'll ever have playoffs for the national championship?
I don't see how. We're on different educational schedules, some on the tri-semesters, some on the quarters. We have different exam periods. And besides, football is a contact sport, and as both of us know, when you run into each other, you get hurt. It's not like baseball or basketball or some of the sports that they can go ahead and play. Personally, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think it'll ever work out. Will you?
No, I don't. I think it's very difficult to even begin to start. I mean, we've had a committee appointed with NCAA and the Football Coaches Association that's made a study of it, and they've just been on dead center. They haven't been able to do anything.
I was on an NCAA committee a couple of years ago to study the feasibility of the playoff system, and we didn't find any. As a matter of fact, the committee was disbanded.
Well, I don't think that a playoff system is compatible with any kind of an academic atmosphere. I mean, we have to go along with the hypocrisy, if it is, but we have to go along with the notion that a university is a place to educate a boy, not to train a Green Bay Packer. And I think you just make do with traditional rivals and traditional bowl games and traditional intersectional games, and try to arrive at a champion that way. Any other way would be to totally professionalize college football, and Lord knows it's professional enough already.
The prospects for a playoff aren't very promising. But if we do have a playoff, who has the most to lose? Well, probably the bowl games. So let's see how they feel about the playoff system. First, from the Big Ten, Commissioner Bill Reed.
I'm such a fan of the Rose Bowl and the association which the Big Ten has with the Pacific 8 Conference there. I think that a playoff system would disrupt the bowl games and all that they have meant for football.
From the Orange Bowl, Jack Baldwin.
Well, in my opinion, the Bowls certainly would oppose a national playoff system. They have evidenced that opinion on many occasions. Basically, the Bowls feel that if national playoff did evolve, that it would be ruinous as far as the Bowls as they're constituted today.
The money is the prime reason that many conferences do oppose any kind of national playoff. I know our Southeastern Conference is vigorously opposed to it. The reason is obvious. The Southeastern Conference has had 5 or 6 teams every year in bowl games. The receipts are shared. Every member of the conference shares in their receipts, and this becomes a substantial factor in their operation, in their budget.
I'm for bowls because bowls have meant a great deal to the Southeastern Conference over the years, and to the University of Alabama in particular. And if they could find a way to not affect the bowls and have a playoff, well, I would be for it.
George Olson of the Gator Bowl.
Well, I told them when they were talking about this several years ago that we would be very pleased to play a quarterfinal round in the Gator Bowl if they establish it, provided they would guarantee us the Southeastern Conference champion against the Big Ten champion every year.
So we need a playoff that won't extend the season too long, won't interfere with studies, and won't ruin the traditional bowl games. We feel that any sort of an extended 8 to 16 team playoff is simply unworkable. We feel the polls are valuable, but as Joe Paterno said earlier, if baseball relied strictly on opinion polls, the 1969 New York Mets would never have been world champions. So our plan is similar to one presented by Ara Persigian of Notre Dame several years ago. We urge the NCAA to set up a committee to determine first if a playoff is necessary. If not, if one team has dominated the season, as Ohio State did in 1968, then forget a postseason playoff. If the committee believes an extra game is vital, as it would have been in 1969 with Texas and Penn State, then the committee will name the 2 teams. Now, they should play 2 weeks after the end of the regular season, or about the middle of December. This setup would not affect the major bowls either in interest or by robbing them of teams. We know this plan will draw criticism, but we feel a positive attitude toward a playoff is a must.
I don't think there's any question it can be done. I disagree with people who say it can't be worked out. I think all we have to do is start talking about our target date is 1976 for a playoff. And then people say, well, you've got games scheduled through 1980. Well, all the NCAA has to do is say, well, all schedules are not valid after 1974. That gives you 4 years. After that, you've got to start thinking about the playoff situation, and everybody has to start scheduling only 4 years ahead of time.
Maybe the question should be not polls or playoff, but polls and a playoff. Polls or Playoff has been brought to you by DuPont, makers of Anti-Leak Xerox Antifreeze, guaranteed not to run out on you. Rally Wax, the half-hour car wax, and easy-to-use Lucite paints, the Work Skippers.